Hey, everybody, and welcome to Simulmedia Live. My name is Matt Collins. I'm so glad you're joining us wherever you're joining us, especially under the circumstances. It's really great to have you here, and I'm excited to share with you the content for today. Uh, so, this is the week when, under ordinary circumstances, we would see the celebration of the upfront season. This is the season in television media when the broadcast networks, the cable networks, come out with a preview of their fall slate. And they do that so they can lock in advertising revenue early, passing on the promise of lower cost to advertisers and agencies who take advantage of buying 3, 4, or 5 months in advance. And it comes with glitz and glamour and stars and Hollywood. And of course, all of that right now is on hold. And it's on hold obviously for obvious reasons, but it's being fed this upfront marketplace changing is being fed by the buy side as well. Marketers, understandably, are thinking about September, October, November, and saying, many of them, I don't know what it is that I'm going to be able to spend on advertising. I need right now more flexibility than ever. I need to be able to make decisions much closer to the activation moment. And I'm not so sure that I can put a lot of money in advance right now. And at some point that's likely to change, may change, but for now, advertisers are having to develop new muscles about how to navigate a market that has more uncertainty than it has in years. So, in anticipation of this moment, we at Simulmedia have been thinking about, well, what happens next if the upfront market, if making big commitments in advance of shows airing or campaigns running is something that's much harder to do, what might take its place? And certainly one of the things that's talked a lot about is an increase in the size of the scatter market. This is the market that's sold not in the upfronts, but much closer to when an ad airs. And it is typically used by advertisers who need flexibility. Back in my day, I worked for a video game publisher, and video games are at their core software. And software, for any of you who've worked in it, you know this, software has and needs a lot of flexibility in its production schedule. So around this time of year, my company would say, well, we think we're going to have a new game to launch sometime around the first week of November. And then September would arrive and we'd come to find out actually we need another 2 to 3 weeks to polish the game. All of that need for flexibility really put a premium for us on buying scatter television, which basically meant that we weren't going to buy it months in advance. We were going to wait till much closer to when we had some certainty about product availability. And that's when we were going to go into the market. And our hypothesis is that the scatter market, because of its flexibility as a whole, is going to be larger, more active for advertisers and agencies than ever before. So if scatter is going to be larger, if advertisers need flexibility, if they need speed and options to get on air, off air quickly, what's the best way to do that? Well, a couple of years ago, we worked on a piece of content called Audience versus Index, and it explored an audience-based approach to doing scatter market TV buying. How do you use audience data to go and find more reach of your target customer using the scatter market? And how does that compare to what is very familiar to many people in the media world, which is an index-based approach? And we produced a report that talked an awful lot about these techniques, what it meant to be audience versus index. And we thought, as we approach this moment, when the scatter market is likely to be much more significant than it has in years, if ever, coupled with, or as a part of, a need for agencies and brands to give themselves flexibility and options rather than locking themselves into big commitments, we thought now's the time to revisit this piece of content and share once again what we know and how to do an audience-based approach to television advertising to increase reach, to increase efficiency, and especially now for advertisers to get better performance, better actual results from their campaigns. So joining me now, as he did then, is my colleague, our Vice President of Advertising Operations at Simulmedia, Connor Finnegan. Connor, it's good to see you, sir. How are you?
Good, Matt. How you doing?
I'm all right. I'm all right. And we were talking before this, and the sun is shining. So, given the fact that it felt like April was sort of like March, March part two, I feel
Yeah,
like I'll take warmer weather. But thank you so much for taking time out to walk us through this.
absolutely, absolutely.
Um, let's talk first about what it means to be audience based. Can you just in quick terms define that for people who may not know about it or have heard about it obliquely but haven't really spent much time with it before?
Sure. Audience-based is a very granular option of targeting. Audience-based is you focus on a group of individuals that you know are going to react to your advertising. I mean, to say that audience-based is different than any other advertising today is not true in that all advertising is audience-based. I'm going after adults 18 to 49, or I'm going to talk to adults 18 to 49 who have a pet or a dog or eat a lot of bacon, right? So it all starts with an audience. All advertising starts with an audience. If I want to reach my message and deliver my message in front of somebody. When we talk about audience-based selling, the way that we're talking about it here, and audience-based buying is that we get rid of the layers of identifying sort of inventory or context or content, and we look truly at the audience wherever they are on TV. So you kind of you separate everything. You don't care like I need to be on Bravo or E or TNT or TBS, but focus on the audience and you build up from there. So almost like a ground up approach as opposed to a top down, which we'll get to in a second.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned this comparison to context. Context-based buying is oftentimes paired with some notion of audience through the concept of an index. And
Mm-hmm.
so tell us about what an index captures, Connor.
An index captures the sort of relative composition of the audience you're going after as it compares to other things that you're looking at. So if it's programs, if it's networks, and what it does is if a general population audience, let's say, is 10%, and that's our target audience we're going after, and I'm watching a program, any one of the programs right now, Last Dance on ESPN, we talked about that documentary right before this, and let's say that whatever audience I was going after was 10%. And then this audience within Last Dance, 20% of those people watching Last Dance are part of my target audience. I would then essentially over index, meaning that program would be a viable audience from an index based selection for finding more of that audience sort of regularly on television. And I might select that as one of my programs.
And hearing you describe these two relative approaches, it seems to me that, and I recall this from our first conversation around audience index, is that the one thing that the index doesn't tell you is the efficiency associated with reaching that audience concentration. It's just simply a measure of how concentrated a certain audience is within a program relative to a broader universe. But it doesn't tell you how much it's going to cost to actually reach them, which is why indexing really only tells you a part of the picture. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right. It tells you part of the picture. You don't know cost, and you also don't know based on the one network or another program versus another program. Both may over-index, but maybe the audience underneath that is the same. And if it's the
Right.
same, then you might be paying double for the same audience versus an audience-based approach. Again, building the individual layers up from the bottom. You can actually see that you can see the unique audience you're able to deliver much easier than trying to start off with an index-based plan. One other thing about indices and index-based, and we talked about this last time, which I want to reiterate here, is it's a very limiting approach. If you're just going to say that, okay, I only want everything that over indexes by a value of X, right? You're going to drop off maybe premium inventory where certain audiences live. They don't live up in the over indexing areas, they live down here. And so when you start thinking of an index based approach, you actually start going to the well again and again and again, and you might hit the same people again and again and again.
So we're talking, Connor, about this marrying this audience-based approach to the moment we're in, which is the likelihood of a significantly larger scatter market, a smaller upfront market, fewer advertisers wanting to lock in long-term commitments right now. Our Simulmedia's clientele thrives on an audience-based approach. I'm sure we're going to cover this as we get into some of the data that we've prepared and are going to be sharing. But in broad brushstrokes, Connor, what are the benefits that the advertisers who have embraced this approach, whether with Simulmedia or someone else, what benefits are they seeing relative to advertisers who continue to operate following a context or index-based approach?
I think they're seeing the benefit of making sure their message and delivering their message in front of the right people. I mean, that's all we show left and right when we show what somebody is doing today with their current approaches and what they're doing with a Simon Media-like approach or an audience-based approach in that. And you look at the audience you're reaching, and then on top of that, right, we're getting into a world where TV is you're starting to show the performance of TV. And it all starts whether it's promoting a program that we do on one side or promoting a downloadable app or downloading a tech product that you can buy at a store. Reaching the right audience generally leads to those off channel or off TV screen purchases. And so the benefit is in the performance. And we've learned over these past years that starting with the right audience, even before we had anything to measure that audience or that performance, we would end up with almost better results. I mean, they would see the stuff working, and we have proof in the pudding in that we have a lot of advertisers that have given us their entire budgets at an audience-based approach because the results keep showing up year after year after year after year. So it's really sort of exciting when they get on that, or you see them dabble in audience-based approach and then they kind of expand it even further because they do see the benefits of being able to target. Or think about it as testing too. If I buy in the upfront, I'm left with what I bought. I can't buy anything else, and so we don't pre-buy any inventory here. And I know a lot of other folks in the scatter market, you don't pre-buy generally anyway, but we don't pre-buy anything so that we're able to actually change our audiences on the fly. So you want to target somebody that has an iPhone or somebody that has a Samsung or somebody that has whatever, you name it, any product, we can kind of tailor the message to that particular audience and quickly and get on the air within days.
So the audience-based approach, to sum it up, is relying on what is really proven sound marketing academics that in order to be successful, and by that I mean grow, in order to grow your brand, you need to know who your target audience is, and then your advertising needs to reach as many of them as possible. And then you can layer on top of this, and people like Byron Sharp have, with the notion of regularity. So it's not just a one and done, but being there on a regular basis with creative that is distinctive. Some of that make for another juicy live stream some other time, and we've covered some of these topics before. But let's get into our example. So we are prepared to publish a follow-up to a white paper we did a couple of years ago, Connor, which you co-wrote about this approach, and we're going to be publishing that over the next day or two for the world to see with our update. And we've pulled some of the content from that and prepared some slides. So Cliff, I'm going to ask you to pull up our very first slide so we can walk people through what this looks like in practice as we compare an audience-based approach to an index-based approach for a very specific audience. And it's one that is familiar to those who may recall the very first white paper on this, because we're drawing on the same women 25 to 54-year-old who are cooking enthusiasts. But Connor, why don't you walk us through what this slide is showing?
Sure. So this really exemplifies audience versus index-based advertising. And if I was truly looking at index, right? If I started with index and I was identifying programs to purchase, this is sort of a no-brainer, right? And we did this last time, and it's fun to do it again to kind of revisit what we had talked about. But if you're looking at women 25 to 54 cooking enthusiasts and with kids, you would look at sort of, I want to be in cooking or in contextual. I want to be cooking channel, I want to be in food, I want to be in programs for which we're making making food or cakes. And so on the left-hand side, if you look at the index versus the right-hand side, the Kids Baking Championship has an index of 167 versus 85. So I wouldn't even have thought of 85. I would have thrown that out the window. I wouldn't have bought 2.5 Men to target women because, maybe Charlie Sheen, maybe he offended me one day, but maybe I wouldn't have thought about it. But that's where audience sort of takes that out of consideration. You take that sort of personal feeling out of it. And so in looking at this, we wanted to show what the difference is, and it's really a layer deeper than just the indices, and the indices don't allow you to go that layer deeper, Matt.
You're exactly right. And, there's another phenomenon that's happened over the last 30 years that I think is also really important to mention in the context of this discussion. You alluded to it a moment ago, Connor, when you talked about how an index-based approach might deprive a media planner or a brand of reaching lots of their target audience efficiently because of where they draw that line. And if they say arbitrarily, for the purposes of this example, I'm only going to buy on programs that have an index of 115 or higher for my audience, because that's where I can get the richest concentration of audience. They're going to be, by definition, excluding a lot of programs that might have very efficient opportunities to reach that audience. And why is that important? Well, in 1990, the average American consumer received 27 cable networks into their home. Now that number is over 200, and as much as streaming has become more and more prevalent, it's an option, and most people who stream also have a cable subscription. It's just giving more and more content choice. So in a world where consumers are watching a lot more variety of programs, taking this index-based approach to exclude from your media planning certain programs, certain networks that fall below a certain index threshold means that you're more and more and more depriving yourself of an opportunity to reach an audience that is perhaps a lot more distributed than it certainly would have been, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So we call this in our world, and we talk about this with advertisers, we refer to this as audience fragmentation. The notion that instead of American audiences flocking to 27 networks, they're now flocking to over 200. With smaller audiences spread out across all of those different programs and networks, and putting an emphasis on some new method of reaching those consumers as they spread out across what I've referred to before as the diaspora of television. Connor, we have updated our white paper to feature a new experiment, and one that I really love what we're featuring here, because it gives truth to the fact that, in fact, men 18 to 34 are watching linear television. They have not all abandoned. They are not all watching other types of video. So walk us through a high-level overview of the experiment that we've run for this 18 to 34-year-old audience.
Sure. So the men 18 to 34 tech savvy enthusiast is about 4.4% of the population. And essentially what we did is we took this audience and we had our platform optimized towards index only, right? We wanted to make unbiased results on either side, so we can show you what an index plan looked like versus an audience-based plan, and kind of let the platform select. There was no human intervention in any of it, and we just wanted to be able to show, like, apples to apples. Here's sort of like what it's doing. We wanted to explain this concept pretty clearly. And so what we did is we built a plan for $500,000 over the course of 1 week, 1 week in TV. We used the same rates, same inventory, all the same types of spots for both plans, and then built them together. So if you pull that slide back up, so on the left-hand side, we have the audience-based plan, and you look, the first thing you sort of stop as you're going down the list, you look at the the CPM. The CPM is $136 on the audience-based plan. Now that audience is really small. It's 4.4% of the population. And so that price is in line with what we would expect that audience to deliver, and not the fact that it's men on television, which men, as Matt, you just mentioned, is still on television, versus the index-based plan of $191. It has to buy some more expensive programming, and it's going to buy some more expensive programming to make sure that audience is there and it's charged or valued as such. You take it a next step deeper and you go down, so the CPM aligns with the impressions. That's the same comparison we just talked about with this. So a little bit more impressions. Overall, though, here's where it starts getting interesting, is in the target audience reached, right? 11% of the audience reached on the audience-based plan for the same amount of money versus 8.6%. Now, 3 total percent doesn't sound like a lot. It's 30% if you look at the two numbers side by side. But what this is only a $500,000 plan. If we're already at $500,000 showing this level of disparity, it only is going to get further as we have to 1 million and 2 million. And we've seen this time and time again with what we've done versus the traditional way of looking at index, or even a traditional plan versus kind of going back to the same inventory and trying to spread ourselves across more networks to solve for that fragmentation. So getting to the next line here, index. Yeah, the audience-based plan, not going to over-index. It generally won't when cost is taken into consideration. But ultimately, you wind up reaching more versus that. So the index-based plan gives you a higher index. You might feel good about yourself. I feel warm and fuzzy. But at the end of the day, you're leaving people on the table not seeing your message.
I'm talking today with Connor Finnegan, who's our Vice President of Advertising Operations at Simulmedia. And we are talking about an audience-based approach to television advertising and how that differs from what many people in the advertising space know as an index-based approach, sometimes thought of as a context or content-based approach. And we're really getting into the numbers about how they differ. And in this case, as Connor mentioned, when you take two budgets side by side, let software run both of them. So this is not a case of a human being cherry picking on either side to tilt the scales. This is about a software doing it in a cold clinical way and just seeing how the results come out for two campaigns of equal budget. By the way, if you have questions for Connor, you can ask them however you're watching. Just drop them down in the LinkedIn window, in the Zoom window, in the Periscope window. We've got eyes on those channels, and we will be making sure to get those questions to Connor before we end the program. So you walked us through a couple of numbers, and the differences are stark in the reach and in the CPM. But let's go to the third slide, Cliff, because there's another number that I think speaks to an important I don't know if we call it an ingredient, a requirement for these plans, but it's the number of networks. It's the very last row. And I can't help but look at this and see that the audience-based plan, Connor, has nearly twice as many networks on it. Is this unique to just this one experiment, or is this a typical byproduct of an audience-based approach?
This is a typical byproduct. You'll generally see, I mean, even as little as like a $50,000 budget, you'll see probably 30 to 40 networks on there. I mean, the weight will be distributed a little bit differently, but you'll have 30 networks. And then for $50,000 in a true or even traditional advertising, I'm not making my calls. I'm not going to execute against 30 networks for $50,000. Even $500,000, I probably would not secure inventory against 24 networks, unless they were all part of the same network family, or I had friends, or I was going to go to the next sporting event or whatever by virtue of purchasing the media. A little jab, but I know this particular plan would probably have less if I was doing $500,000 across TV. I'd probably have maybe 10, maybe even less than for that kind of money. So this is very much indicative of how audience-based planning is.
And you talk about the difficulty in procuring a certain volume of networks based on the budget size. So, for $50,000, what are you going to really be able to get if you take that and roll into a network? This does seem to me to be something that we should touch upon, which is the act of buying. So when you're talking about buying that many networks, typically you would look at that and say there's some more work involved in making all of that possible. How is software coming into the picture here? I mean, you mentioned software being the tool that we use to run this experiment. How is software impacting the way that inventory is procured?
The same sort of way is within days we can transact and get set up against even as much as 90 or 100 different networks, and we've done that for some plans because we immediately take our planning and we take that output and we immediately throw it into our executional sort of channel, and immediately we can transact and send all of our orders out to all of our partners. They can receive it within 30 seconds of us actually putting it, saying that I want this to order. And we're trying even to make that even faster and make it even easier for our partners today. And so they get these. Right now everything, of course, is a little bit email based, but we're turning that into more platform based. So there's some screens on either side for them to be able to do, and it just it just it's just so much quicker. Versus right now, like you still have to send those emails, you still have to make those phone calls. So if an individual buyer was going to make and pick up the phone, they'd have to make as many calls to transact against that inventory. So they're going to make it possibly, and I say possibly and caveat that they might make it as easy as possible to do that.
Connor, let's dig into the networks that these plans bought upon or bought in. And so we've got
Mm-hmm.
our fourth slide, Cliff, if you can share it. This is awfully telling. And the first thing, of course, I notice without getting into all the details is just how much taller of a stack the audience-based plan is from top to bottom. That's indicative of the fact that on that plan, there are 42 networks. And on the index-based plan, you see 24, which is a shallower bar chart. But what stands out? What should people who are looking at these charts, what should they take away? What should they conclude about what this data is showing?
I mean, generally for an index-based plan, it winds up narrowing down the focus to the networks, right? So it's a limited set of networks, which we just talked about. But in here, you can actually see a lot of the weight. Most of the weight is actually, if you look at the bottom half of the screen here, most of the weight is on the top three networks. I mean, top three networks account for 53% of the overall impressions, just three. Now, in more index-based, that might even be higher. But again, platform to platform, even apples to apples comparison, it already was picking more of those networks versus the audience-based plan. Yeah, there's the same network, like comedy is the number one network on both particular plans. But then after that, CNN becomes the next from an audience-based approach, and CNN, not even, I don't even see it on the next list from the index-based approach, but from an audience-based approach, that's exactly where they are. So the shifting of impressions or the spreading out of those impressions, wherein the top seven, I think, total networks make up a total of around 50% of the media weight versus the top three in the index-based plan.
And what this is showing, of course, is that the audience is out there. It's spread out across many, many more networks. Connor, if for those who embrace the index-based approach, is there a greater risk of what we've described in Simulmedia as overfrequency because you're hitting a relatively smaller group of networks and therefore presumably a smaller, well, not just presumably, but based on the actual data from this experiment, a smaller audience, a smaller size audience relative to the audience-based approach. So if I double down on this index-based approach, am I going to be at risk of perhaps buying more frequency?
Yeah, you'll definitely wind up buying more frequency. Audiences are sort of shrinking everywhere, meaning more programs that used to have a higher rating are definitely dropping in rating and being spread out across other programs. And think about it in today's world, which is even more heightened by what we're seeing in terms of content on the networks, in terms of trying to finish the shows they have, finish the content they have, and making sure that they continually are producing. But all production is stopped sort of across the board. Whereas that's why we're seeing folks like Netflix and Hulu release on a more slowed down sort of cadence to make sure that time is filled with when stuff can't be filled on in TV.
Let's take a look at the at also day part distribution. So day parts are the time of day when and programs will run, and typically, I know from even going back to my own days of television advertising, I certainly had to deal with a premium associated with having my ads run in prime time. And I remember my agency letting me know this and letting me making it very clear that running my spot on, I think it was Sunday Night Football or maybe Monday Night Football, not only was it going to put my ad in a place that was considered a very premium program, but it was also during prime time. And I remember my agency really selling me on the virtues of that, just as a qualitative element. But I also remember paying a lot for the privilege. And so this gets back to the notion that indices tell us something about audience composition, but not necessarily efficiency. And that comes through in the way that the day parts get distributed. So Cliff, if we can show the fifth slide that we've prepared, that talks, no, this is the sixth, go back to the one before this. If we can get that slide up, it'll I think very clearly show the breakdown of day parts, and walk us through what this tells you, Connor.
Yeah, I mean, this is I wouldn't say just index-based approach. I would say just more traditional advertising. There's a lot more heavier weight on prime time. That's where the newer episodes of the shows premiere. That's where you're going to start. I want to be in the first episode of those particular programs. So generally, from an index-based approach for a lot of these audiences, it will tend to lead, or at least start with prime time from an index based, because that the concentration's good, and that's exactly where I think my audience might be. But again, like you said, a premium perspective, what we generally see in Simulmedia and any audience based advertising is it's a little bit more evenly distributed, where prime time is a component of, but not the main portion of advertising. I think that the most I've ever seen on any given plan, sort of across the board, may be 40 to 45%, where I've seen on a traditional plan maybe 80 or 90% in prime time, and then certain other day parts just completely left out. I mean, if you look at the words overnight or late night, a lot of those are throwaways for most people, but there's so much concentration, and they're really undervalued for certain audiences. And you can make a claim that I could get them for free, or I could have them for free, but it's really not about just buying any overnight or any late night. It's buying specifically what we want to buy, and the audience-based approach allows us to do that. We know how one combination of one spot or selection of one spot married with another equals what our total reach for the campaign. So indices not gonna give you that. So in this particular case, this example for the tech enthusiast, 26% of the index-based plan media weight, and it cost them about 35% of the budget was spent to garner that much impressions. And so you wasted 35, but you have to allocate a lot more in order to get prime time on its percentage up.
And clearly, if you look at the left side of that column, you see that it seems, just eyeballing it, a much more even distribution. There's less in the way. If you were to graph this, you'd see fewer, shallower peaks and valleys, as more of that advertising budget is spread out over more day parts. But to your point, Connor, it's all about finding the audience, and the audience is where the audience is going to go, with more channels, more programs spread out over more times of day. There are rich pockets of opportunity to be found anywhere across the spectrum. Before we get into our final slide, and we'll wrap up with some concluding remarks, I'll just say that if any of you have questions about an audience-based approach, about audience versus index, or about media planning in the current environment, just raise your hand, ask it in LinkedIn, ask it in Periscope, Twitter, or Zoom, and we'll make sure we get to your questions. And I can already see some questions are piling up. So, Connor, it's funny that these two approaches, in looking at the way that our Simulmedia platform executed both of the experiments, it did not turn out to be an either or scenario across the board. And you pointed out how comedy, for example, appears on both plans. There are some things in common where a program could show up on both, and we actually have an example of this. Cliff, if we can pull up slide 6, this will show that they weren't always opposing, right, Connor?
No, they're not always opposing, and in fact, a lot of the times there's an audience. They'll select a lot of the same plans. I think in these particular cases, again, just like the last time, I would say about maybe 30% of the total spots being selected were similar to both plans. Again, it's still on the little bit lower end, because there is a lot of separation when you do two strategies or different strategies. But we thought this was a sort of a fun one to highlight and call out in both cases. And it's Cartoon Network, and you're like, wait, Cartoon Network's for kids. This particular program is a little bit, and they deem it, or they call it, more family friendly, The Amazing World of Gumball. But there's enough content in there, and we're starting to see in a little more cartoons, some more adult themed humor, that the kids may or may not get, but that the kids get enough of what they're getting. And so it's really about the family coming together. And if you think about a men 18 to 34-year-old, tech savvy or tech enthusiast, it would make sense that both would be, watching this type of content, which we see all the time here. So in this particular case, an index of 245, great on the index-based side, and also the CPM, all right, or the total number of people within this audience, $41 is fantastic. Since we talked about the overall plan, remember, being about 130 and 190 respectively, depending on which side you want. So the fact that this is $41, yeah, it's a lower cost piece, but it's also on the index based side of it. And so you might want to consider her both. And it's a fun enough show. I've seen enough clips to watch. I have not watched myself fully, but I like what I see. So maybe I'll have to add it to my list here during quarantine.
For those who don't know Connor, he is a reliable go-to source for recommendations on what to watch on just about anything. And I have, in fact, right before the show, I was asking him what he's been watching, and we compared notes. But I think I got more out of Connor's recommendations than he got out of mine. Connor, let's get into some audience questions. We've got a few that have piled up, and so I will start with Tim, who is asking: is an audience-based inherently more wasteful because it may not be as targeted? I'm wondering here if it's maybe an index-based approach inherently more wasteful than it because it may not be as targeted. But we'll take the question as it is. Is audience buying inherently more wasteful because it may not be as targeted? And then he follows it by saying, how can you also control for audience duplication if the marketer is interested in reach optimization?
So I'll answer the first question. So, an index-based approach being more wasteful. I mean, it depends on what you think about being wasteful. I mean, some goals of advertising is I want to make sure my frequency is really high. I want to make sure my message reaches the person, multiple times. And in that particular case, then it's not wasteful. Then I don't care how much I reach necessarily. What we've seen is that if you can deliver one message to one more person just once, get that one incremental person, you have a higher likelihood within target to actually get them to do what you want them to do, which is sign up for something on a website, buy something at a store, tune into a particular program. So wasteful is a strong word, but if we're doing waste in terms of reach, then yes, that is the answer. But if you're doing waste in terms of what their ultimate goal is, that's why it matters what their ultimate goal is for the advertiser. So I answer that cautiously and a little tiptoe around it, but I understand people and advertisers have different strategies for why they want to execute. So I don't want to say one, but in the world of audience-based versus index-based, you are going to forego reach, right? And so that will be more wasteful because you won't be able to reach as many and get your message out there. Now, as far as audience duplication concerns, audience-based approach, because we start at the respondent level, right? We know the individual people, right, that make up the definition from the audience. And we can understand when we start selecting inventory that this form of inventory or this spot on this network has an overlap with the spot on this other network. So that when I combine them together, I know my overlap, and our platform goes through and selects based on everything that it slept before it, and understands that the next best unit or the next unit that it's going to select, not just the total concentration of that audience and how much that drives, but how much unique audience it drives. And so an audience-based approach, if it's a true audience-based approach, you have enough data at your fingertips to be able to deduplicate on the level to make sure you're maximizing reach.
Tim, thanks so much for your question. That's a really, really good one. And it comes up an awful lot, especially the audience duplication question comes up an awful lot. And so, Connor, I'm glad you mentioned about how we get that information at a respondent level. That's really critical. So we got a question here from Leslie, and Leslie wants to know, how pure does the approach to audience-based have to be relative to other forms of television advertising? I think what she's getting at here is, can an audience-based approach mingle with other ways of buying?
Absolutely. And as we've seen and as we sort of talked about, is like, look, if you're not doing any audience-based approach, there's only benefits. There's only benefits to adding that into your current mix. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, right? And again, I talked about the executional strategies. I may want to make sure that I'm in a particular program, for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's not even index based. I want to be in this program, and I said this last time, but I want to be in this program because you know what, the client wants to make sure they see themselves in whatever program on Bravo or anything on Walking Dead or AMC, whatever. And so you have that strategy, and so you have to pair with it. But if that's your only strategy, if you only focus on one strategy, you are going to miss out on reach. So it's finding that balance, right? And so I would say this, and this is my direction, and we talked about this last time too, is if you're not doing any audience-based buying, it can only help you to add some. Just add a little bit, take 10, 20%, even try it, right? For what you're doing. And then if you're doing some today, hopefully today has shown you the benefit that you can do more with it. And eventually, at some point, you could get to a point where you're doing strictly 100% audience-based approach. We have plenty of advertisers that work with us for this because of the being nimble, being on TV quickly, and navigating like, I want to try this, I want to try that, I want to get on TV quick, I want to change my message here. You can do that with TV, and you can do that with audience and kind of learn from it and make sure you're maximizing reach.
Leslie, that's a great question. Thank you. We do get that an awful lot. And actually, we've got a related question that comes through from Georgia. And Georgia wanted to know about whether or not we see any value at all in contextual evaluation. And so, for example, if you're running, you go back to the very first slide that we showed or talked about women cooking enthusiasts 25 to 54. If an advertiser is promoting a cooking product or maybe a food for at-home food preparation, are we really saying that in this case that there would be no contextual value to placing it in a program or in and around a program about food or about cooking? Or is it really such that that the context in this case doesn't matter?
Again, it's part of the belief that I would want to be if I was advertising for a cooking type element or maybe a product that I'd want to be within a cooking show. If I was a DIY, I'd like to be in a like a show on HGTV in terms of Fixer Upper or anything along those lines. Like there is this comfort around being within index. Within being in like a contextual type of program like that matches that content. As far as performance is concerned, it really what we've seen is going with reaching as much of that audience as possible. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, and you have to balance that with like, I need to make sure that I feel like I'm getting what I want to match for. But look, we were on the same network. So the audience-based plan was on the same network. So you may not be in that specific prime time or that specific show on that network, but that network is on our plan as well. Food is not like, if you think about that audience, that network, we just were calling out two different spots to highlight what does an index-based approach versus audience-based approach look like. But that's not to say that we're forgoing contextual-like inventory. In fact, a lot of the times there is this basis of contextual. We just find the pockets within there, so we're not necessarily overpaying for reaching the audience within those environments that you normally would get. But if you have to be in a program and you want to be in the program, by all means, just make it a part of your overall strategy and find some balance for it.
As I'm hearing you talk about this, Connor, and Georgia, thank you for your question. As I'm hearing you talk about this, it reminds me of a portfolio approach to holding an investment. That it's not about going all in on growth stocks or all in on international stocks or all in on real estate or all in on municipal bonds. Although those are all strategies that you can pursue, there are many financial services companies that will advocate for taking a portfolio level approach where you take on pieces of each of those strategies to maximize your gain and reduce downside risk or whatever your goal is. And it sounds like actually your advice here about not necessarily abandoning techniques that for whatever reason may work for you, but adding to it, augmenting with things that can give you other benefits is something that's at the very least worth experimenting with.
Absolutely.
Well, Connor, we've exhausted the questions. We've once again got a chance to dive into such a really key tool for marketers and agencies to approaching a market that is unlike any in recent memory, if ever, when it comes to television advertising, with a much smaller upfront market, a likelihood for a substantially larger scatter market, and the need to approach that scatter market with more muscles, better brains, speed, agility. And it really seemed to me that the audience-based approach was one that was worth bringing back for folks to learn about. And I'm glad that you took us through it. So Connor, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
We're going to post our white paper on this subject in the next couple of days on our website, and the slides that we shared will all be captured in that white paper. So no need to distribute the presentation separately. All those data points will be captured in the white paper, and I encourage all of you to download it. And if you have questions, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and know what's on your mind. And if we can be helpful in any way, of course, we're here for that. So that wraps up today's show. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining. It's really great to have you here. We feel privileged to have you watching and learning with us. So glad you could do it. I hope you're all well. Be safe, be good, and we'll see you next time on Simulmedia Live. Take care, everybody.